In 2007, I landed a college internship at Shenandoah National Park in Virginia, which involved spending the summer in a fire lookout tower deep in the forest. The job was simple: monitor the area for any signs of wildfire, ensure that hikers stayed on safe routes, and report any suspicious activity. It sounded like the perfect opportunity for a nature lover like me. Solitude didn't bother me, and I was excited to spend entire days surrounded by mountains and silence. But by the third week, the silence started to feel different. One day during my morning patrol, I noticed something strange among the trees, about 50 meters from the tower. There was a wooden figure, some sort of crudely sculpted effigy. It was made of dry branches tied together with vines, like a poorly crafted attempt to create a human form. As odd as it was, my rational mind told me that some camper probably made it as a joke or part of some ritual. I decided to knock it down, thinking it would be wise to remove what could be a potential fire hazard. But the next day, there it was again, in the exact same spot. A growing sense of unease began to take over. I knew no one should have been around. Hikers usually stayed far away from the lookout tower, and the area around it was difficult to access without being noticed. Yet somehow someone had put that wooden thing back up. Night fell, and the idea of sleeping just 50 meters away from a creepy effigy unsettled me. The feeling of being watched followed me every minute, and I started to question whether I was really alone out there. A few days later, I woke up in the middle of the night to an orange glow lighting up the forest. When I looked out the window, my heart raced. The wooden figure was on fire. I bolted down the tower's stairs, grabbed the fire extinguisher, and put out the flames before they could spread. I had no idea how it had happened, but my mind started wandering into dark places. Someone was messing with me, and this someone wasn't just playing around. They wanted to truly scare me. That same night, the real terror began. From the top of the tower, I saw shadows moving between the trees. At first, I thought my mind was playing tricks on me, but soon I realized they were people. At least 5 or 6 hooded figures, all slowly moving toward the tower. The burning effigy had been terrifying enough, but what happened next was far worse. They were carrying torches. Panic set in. There was no easy escape. I was surrounded, and the only way out was the staircase leading straight to them. Soon, I smelled smoke rising, and I realized they had set the base of the tower on fire. The heat was already climbing up the wooden beams, and I knew I had only minutes. Without thinking twice, I threw myself out of the second-floor window of the tower. The fall was rough, but fear and adrenaline pushed me to my feet immediately. I ran without looking back. I found a hunting lodge a few kilometers away, where I got help. But by the time the park rangers arrived at the site, there was no sign of the hooded figures, and the tower was completely in flames. The authorities didn't believe my story. To them, it was more likely that I had caused the fire, maybe through negligence or some sort of breakdown. They treated me as if I was mentally unstable, and no matter how much I pleaded, nothing I said made sense to them. In the months that followed, I was subjected to therapy and psychological evaluations. No one believed me. The story of the wooden figure, the hooded people, sounded like a delusion to anyone who heard it. To this day, I can't understand who or what was tormenting me in that forest, but one thing is certain. Something out there, hidden deep within Shenandoah National Park, is watching, waiting for the next unsuspecting person to cross its path. Being a fire lookout always seemed like the perfect job to me. Solitude, nature, and the peaceful quiet of the wilderness. My tower was located in Mount Hood National Park, Oregon, surrounded by miles of trees and wildlife. It was the kind of isolation most people would never desire, but to me, it was peace. At least, that's what I thought, until the day the silence became deadly. That morning, everything seemed normal. I woke up early, did my usual rounds, and spent the day scanning the forest for any signs of smoke. It was a hot summer day, and the wind, which usually rustled through the treetops, had gone still. So far, nothing out of the ordinary. But by mid-afternoon, I started noticing something wrong. At first, it was subtle. The sound of birds, which typically filled the air, had vanished. The wind, normally whistling through the trees, was completely absent. An oppressive silence had settled over everything. I climbed down from the tower to investigate. As soon as my feet hit the forest floor, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The silence there was absolute, as though the world around me had been put on pause. I walked a few meters trying to figure out what was happening, and then I saw something that made me stop cold. On the ground around the tower were dead animals. Deer, squirrels, birds, all lying still on the forest floor. No visible injuries, no blood. It was as if something had drained the life from them, leaving their bodies empty, soulless. An immediate sense of danger washed over me. Something was deeply wrong. The heat of the day seemed to disappear, replaced by an eerie cold that made my skin crawl. I rushed back to the tower and tried to radio my supervisor, but all I could hear was static, constant, unrelenting static. I twisted the knobs, adjusted the frequency, and pressed the transmitter, but nothing. The only response I got was that haunting, hissing noise. I was completely cut off. Then I saw it, a shadow, in the distance among the trees. It was hard to make out at first, almost as if it was blending with the darkness of the forest. But it was there, unmoving, watching. I stared, hoping my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then the shadow moved. Not quickly, not in a threatening way, but just enough for me to realize that it was aware of me. And worse, it was coming closer. My heart raced, and all I could think was to get back up in the tower. I scrambled up the steps, feeling each one like a countdown towards something terrible. Once at the top, I bolted the door shut, though I knew a simple wooden door wouldn't protect me from whatever that thing was. I tried the radio again, but the static persisted, louder now, almost as if the air itself was filled with the sound. The silence outside, paired with the noise inside, created an unbearable tension. I looked out the window, searching for the shadow again. This time it was much closer. I could clearly see it now, moving slowly through the trees. It wasn't human, though it resembled the shape of one, a dark mass, absorbing all the light around it, leaving nothing but darkness in its wake. With every step it took, the forest seemed to wilt even more, as though the life was being sucked from the trees, just like it had been from the animals. Time moved strangely. The clock seemed frozen, and the sun, which should have been setting, stayed motionless in the sky. The shadow was now nearly at the base of the tower. I could feel the cold radiating from it, an intense chill spreading through the room. My body was frozen in fear, every instinct screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. The radio's static grew louder, mixing with a deep, otherworldly hum that seemed to come from beyond this world. Then, out of nowhere, the radio went silent. The static stopped, and I heard a whisper, low, almost inaudible, but unmistakably directed at me. I couldn't understand the words, but the intent was clear. Whatever it was calling me. Desperate, I tried to block out the sound, covering my ears and shutting my eyes, praying that this was all just a nightmare. But then the footsteps began, heavy and deliberate. They echoed up the tower's staircase. The last sound I heard before everything went silent again was the door to the tower slowly creaking open. I don't know what happened after that. All I remember is waking up at dawn, lying on the floor of the tower, the radio turned off, and the forest once again filled with the sounds of birds chirping. The shadow was gone, as if it had never been there. The bodies of the dead animals were nowhere to be found, leaving me questioning if any of it had ever happened. I never learned what really occurred that night, and honestly, I'd rather not know. I requested a transfer that same week and never returned to that park. The forest, with all its silence, hides something that doesn't belong to this world. And whatever it is, it's still out there, waiting for the next person willing or unlucky enough to listen. It was the third month of my job as a fire lookout in Lassen National Park, California. The place was isolated, but that never bothered me. In fact, I liked the solitude. The dense forest and mountainous horizon offered a peace I couldn't find anywhere else. But that night, in the midst of a storm, something changed. It all began with a simple interference on the radio, but what seemed like a technical glitch soon turned into something far more disturbing. The storm had arrived without warning, as often happened in the region. The radio was usually silent, except for occasional check-ins with my supervisor. However, that night, amidst the constant sound of rain hitting the windows and the wind howling outside, a strange noise began to emerge from the radio. At first, it was just static and crackling. Then, slowly, I began to make out voices amidst the noise, like someone speaking on an old recording. I stopped what I was doing and leaned in, trying to make out the words. They were muffled conversations, interrupted by screams. The voices spoke quickly, in a tone of panic. I could make out a few scattered words: fire, hurry, there's no time. With each passing minute, the voices became clearer, and the screams more intense. It was as if I were listening to a recounting of a catastrophic fire, with people desperately trying to escape. The fear in those voices was palpable, almost as if I could feel their agony. I turned off the radio, trying to convince myself that it was just the storm causing interference, but something in the back of my mind wouldn't let it go. The next morning, curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to investigate. I searched through the small archive in the tower, and after a few hours, found a record of a fire that had occurred in that very area 50 years ago. It was one of the largest disasters the park had ever faced. A group of forest rangers and tower lookouts, all stationed nearby, had perished in an uncontrollable wildfire. They had tried, in vain, to warn each other over the radio before being surrounded by flames. The descriptions in the archive matched exactly what I had heard the previous night. The timing of the fire, the desperate words the victims used, it was all exactly what I had listened to over the radio. My heart raced as I realized that the voices weren't just interference. I was hearing the last moments of those lookouts, somehow recorded in time, trapped in a storm that echoed their fear. That night, the weather calmed, but my nerves did not. I tried to keep my mind busy, but every now and then, I would glance at the radio with an uneasy feeling. Something was wrong. Around midnight, I heard a sound that chilled me to my bones. Footsteps, slow and heavy, climbing the stairs of the tower. The sound of wet boots hitting the wooden steps was unmistakable, even with the wind still blowing outside. I froze in place, trying to control my breathing. Each step seemed closer, until they stopped right at the door. I stood up slowly, expecting to hear a knock, a voice, anything to indicate that someone was there. But nothing happened. The door remained closed. The only sound I could hear was my own heartbeat pounding in my chest. With a trembling hand, I opened the door, expecting to see someone. But, of course, there was no one. The staircase was empty, the floor still wet from the recent rain, but there were no footprints. I went back inside, confused and frightened. I tried to get back to work, but soon the footsteps began again, this time coming from inside the tower. The sound echoed through the walls, as if something invisible was moving around. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it into every corner, but there was nothing. The voices on the radio, the footsteps, everything seemed to intertwine, as if the tower was alive with the memories of those who had died there so long ago. I stayed awake for the rest of the night, waiting for something else to happen. The radio remained silent, but the feeling of being watched never left. The next day, I requested a transfer out of that tower. I told them what had happened, but, as expected, they attributed everything to stress, solitude, and the storm. They said I was tired, that my mind had been playing tricks on me. But I know what I heard, and to this day, the sound of those footsteps and the terrified voices still haunt me. I never returned to that tower, But every time a storm rolls in, I remember that radio. And I wonder if those voices are still there, trapped in the darkness, waiting for someone to hear their final moments of despair. If you're enjoying the stories so far, don't forget to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel for more creepy stories just like these. And hey, have you ever had a paranormal experience? Drop a comment below and share your story with us. We'd love to hear it. Now let's dive into the next story. After years of dreaming about becoming a park ranger, I finally landed the position I had always wanted. I was back in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, the very place where I had grown up camping with my father, the place where my love for nature had first taken root. It felt like everything had fallen perfectly into place. I would spend most of my time isolated in a fire lookout tower, watching over the forests I had known so well. But along with the comfort of familiarity came the return of something I had hoped to forget: the whistles. And this time, things would get far stranger. It was already my third week in the tower, and I had settled into a routine. Solitude had never been an issue for me, and I enjoyed my days spent monitoring the forests, taking note of subtle changes, the shifting of the wind, animal tracks, and of course, keeping an eye out for any signs of fire. But one night, in the kind of silence that reminded me of my childhood camping trips, I heard the whistle again. At first, it was faint, so quiet that I almost dismissed it as my imagination. But then it came again, just as I remembered it, sharp, clear, and echoing through the trees. The old fear I had felt as a child returned instantly. It was the same eerie sound, the same unnatural pull that made me feel like something was watching me. I stood there, frozen at the top of the tower, trying to convince myself it was just the wind. But the whistle persisted, and this time, unlike those nights from my childhood, I felt an overwhelming urge to follow it. Grabbing my flashlight, I descended the tower and started walking toward the source of the sound. As I walked, the forest around me seemed strangely dense, the trees closer than I remembered, their shadows stretching unnaturally long. The whistle continued, always just ahead, leading me deeper into the woods. My feet moved almost on instinct, as if the whistle was personally calling to me. With every step, the urge to uncover the source of that sound grew stronger, like an invisible force pulling me forward. After about 30 minutes of walking, I reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood something I never expected to see: a spiral staircase. It was old, covered in moss and rust, yet perfectly intact, as if it had been left there decades ago and forgotten by everyone. It made no sense. There was no structure nearby, no logical reason for a staircase to be there. It twisted upward into the trees, like some surreal sculpture, completely out of place in the wilderness. The whistle stopped the moment I saw it. Inside my mind, curiosity and fear were battling for control. I knew something was wrong. The overwhelming feeling that I had stepped into forbidden territory was almost unbearable, but I couldn't look away. As I shone my flashlight on the staircase, I remembered something that disturbed me even more. An old park ranger, who had worked in this same area, had disappeared a few years back. I had found his journal among the belongings left behind in the tower. He had written about strange sounds in the woods, whistles, and something he referred to as a mysterious structure. At the time, I didn't give it much thought, assuming the man had lost his mind from isolation. But now, the truth was standing right in front of me. I felt a strong urge to climb the staircase. Something inside me, like a silent voice, encouraged me to place my foot on the first step. But before I could make a move, a cold gust of wind blew through the clearing. It was as though the air itself was warning me not to go any further. The forest, which had felt alive just moments before, now seemed to be holding its breath, watching me, waiting for what I would do next. Everything was still, and the weight of that silence was suffocating. I should have turned back then, but instead, I decided to investigate more closely. I touched the staircase. It was cold, metallic, and sent a shiver through my body. That's when I realized something even more unsettling. The missing ranger's journal had described exactly this. A staircase that appeared out of nowhere, like a twisted invitation to something no one should explore. And he had vanished soon after writing those final words. Before I could make any further decisions, I heard heavy footsteps in the leaves behind me. My heart nearly stopped. I spun around, flashlight shaking in my hand, but there was nothing, just trees and darkness. Fear turned into panic. I ran back to the tower as fast as I could, the whistle once again echoing through the trees, following me, chasing me until I was safely back inside the tower. In the days that followed, I returned to the clearing several times, trying to find the staircase again. But it was gone. The forest seemed normal, as if what I had seen had never existed. Yet the sensation that something or someone was still watching me lingered every time I set foot outside. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but as expected, he shrugged it off. He said that rangers sometimes let their imaginations run wild after long periods of isolation. But I knew that wasn't the case. I had seen the staircase with my own eyes, and the whistle still haunted me at night. The ranger who disappeared? He was never found. In 1997, when I was just a teenager, I took a summer job that seemed like the perfect opportunity for someone like me who wanted to escape everyday life. I was assigned as a fire lookout in a remote tower in the Pacific Northwest in Olympic National Park, Washington. The idea of spending weeks isolated in a tower, surrounded only by dense forests and majestic mountains, felt like a dream. The isolation didn't scare me. I was confident and eager to embrace the solitude. But from the first week, something strange started happening, turning the experience into a nightmare that still haunts me. The first few days were peaceful. My shifts consisted of scanning the horizon for smoke, reading books, and occasionally chatting with my supervisor over the radio, who was miles away. I quickly adapted to the routine, enjoying the calmness of the forest that stretched as far as the eye could see. But on the fourth night, as I watched the sunset, I noticed something unusual. On the edge of the forest, far below, almost hidden among the trees, I saw dark figures. They were human-shaped, but motionless, watching from a distance. I assumed I was tired, that my eyes were playing tricks on me after hours of being alone. The next morning, I mentioned the figures to my supervisor over the radio. He laughed it off and said that isolation could do that to anyone. My colleagues in other towers, when I reached out to them, didn't take it seriously either. It's normal to see things, one of them told me. You get used to it after a while. But I knew it wasn't an illusion. Deep down, I was certain. And as the days went by, the figures kept appearing. They weren't just on the edge of the forest anymore. They were closer now. I could see them more clearly, slowly moving between the trees as if they were drawing nearer to the tower. The tension started to build. At night, I heard noises I couldn't explain, soft footsteps in the underbrush, branches snapping, low whispers that the wind carried to me. I tried to ignore them, convincing myself it was just the isolation playing with my mind. But deep down, the feeling of impending danger was impossible to shake. One evening, as dusk was falling, I tried contacting my supervisor over the radio again. This time, the radio simply wouldn't work. Without warning, all communication failed completely, leaving me entirely isolated. That night, fear became unbearable. The figures were closer than ever, almost within view of the tower. I could feel their eyes on me, even though I couldn't make out their faces. The noises in the forest grew louder, like something was steadily closing in. In a moment of pure panic, I grabbed my emergency flare and fired it into the sky. The burst of light cut through the darkness, illuminating the forest below. To my surprise, the figures retreated quickly, as if the light had scared them off. But the flare also started a small fire in the area. I stayed up all night, waiting for something or someone to show up. With the fire slowly spreading, I knew rescue teams would arrive soon. And sure enough, the next morning, a team arrived, guided by the smoke. I explained what had happened, hoping they would understand what I'd seen. But like my supervisor, they attributed everything to stress, solitude, and isolation. The fire was contained quickly, but I knew that wasn't the real problem. Something else was there in those forests. The months that followed were filled with doubt. Could it be possible that I had only imagined it? That isolation had truly driven me to the brink of a breakdown? But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. The figures, the sounds, the tangible fear, all of it still haunted me, even after I returned home. Years later, I decided to face my fears and return to the tower. I wanted answers, to prove to myself that it had all been in my mind. But when I reached the site, I felt the same sensation of being watched. The trees remained silent, but the weight of what I had experienced lingered. The dark figures never appeared again, but the mystery of those nights was never resolved. To this day, the memory of them remains like a scar in my mind, a reminder that there are things deep in the forest we may never fully understand. Being a fire lookout in a remote tower seemed like the perfect job for someone who craved silence, isolation, and the peace of untouched nature. I'd always been that kind of person. The solitude never bothered me. It was almost therapeutic. My tower was located in a secluded part of Yosemite National Park, California, surrounded by mountains and miles of dense forest. The job was simple: watch for signs of fire or suspicious activity and report back. But as I soon discovered, solitude has a way of revealing dark secrets. By the third week of my shift, I began hearing something unusual on the radio at night. During the day, the radio was mostly quiet, save for occasional check-ins from my supervisor. But at night, a faint, almost indistinguishable voice would emerge through the static. The first time I heard it, I could barely make out the words. It was a woman's voice, soft, faint, and garbled by the interference, but the words were clear enough to chill me. "Please help me." I sat up, immediately alert, adjusting the radio and switching frequencies to try and clear the static. But the voice disappeared as quickly as it had come. I tried to push the incident from my mind, assuming it was just some radio interference or a prank. But the next night, the voice returned, clearer this time. The same desperate plea, repeated in a quiet, trembling tone. "Please help me." It was impossible to ignore now. By the third night, the voice appeared right after sunset. This time, it sounded more urgent, almost breathless, as if the person on the other end was in immediate danger. I tried to respond, speaking into the radio, but every time I did, the static intensified, drowning out my voice. I decided that night to track the signal, to find out where it was coming from. I pulled out my map of the area, trying to estimate the direction based on the strength of the signal. Every night, as the voice came back, I grew more obsessed with finding the source. The more I listened, the more I became convinced that something terrible was happening, and the voice, though real, seemed off. There was something about its tone, its rhythm, that didn't feel entirely human. After days of searching, the signal finally led me to a location not far from my tower, but remote enough that few ventured there. It was a dense clearing, overgrown with moss and thick vegetation, and at its center stood the ruins of an old lookout tower. What disturbed me the most was that I had never heard of this tower before. It wasn't on any of the current maps, and no one had ever mentioned it. It looked abandoned for decades, the wood rotting, the structure leaning dangerously, as if forgotten by time. With my radio in hand, I cautiously approached the tower. Inside, I found a small, decrepit cabin that had once been used as storage for supplies. The door was slightly ajar, and inside was something that made my blood run cold: a radio. An old, weathered radio, still faintly crackling with static. It was the same noise I had been hearing at night. I moved closer, shining my flashlight around the cabin. Dust covered everything, and there was no sign of life. But as I switched on my own radio, the familiar voice emerged again, this time louder than ever. "Please, help me. I'm trapped." My hands shook as I adjusted the frequency. The voice was so clear now, it felt as though the person was standing right next to me. But there was no one there. I searched the cabin, desperate for some explanation. In the corner, I found an old logbook covered in dust. The last entry was from 1962, written by a lookout named Daniel. He had written about his isolation and described hearing a voice on the radio in the dead of night. In the final pages, his handwriting became shaky and nearly unreadable. "She keeps calling. I see her now. She's close, but she's not human." I dropped the logbook, my heart pounding. I looked around the empty cabin again, but everything was silent now. Even the radio had gone quiet, the static fading into an eerie silence. I quickly left the ruins, feeling the overwhelming presence of something watching me. That night, I didn't hear the voice again, but the feeling of being watched never went away. I reported the incident to the park authorities, but they dismissed it as nothing more than stress from isolation. They claimed I had been hearing interference from an old, malfunctioning radio signal. But I knew better. Whatever had been calling for help through that radio wasn't from this world. And whatever it was still out there, waiting for someone else to hear its call. For as long as I can remember, I've always dreamed of becoming a park ranger. It probably came from the countless weekends I spent camping with my father in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, Tennessee. Every week after school, I could barely wait for Friday, when we'd load the truck with our tent, backpacks, and flashlights, and head off for another adventure. The mountains and forests of the park became my second home. There, I felt free, connected to nature and the peace the wilderness brings. But at the same time, there was always something in the depths of those woods that left me feeling uneasy. I was about 10 years old when I first heard the whistles. It was a quiet night. Our camp set up near a river, and the crackling fire provided a warm, comforting glow. My dad was preparing dinner, and as usual, I was exploring the surroundings. I wasn't far, just a few meters from the tent, gazing up at the stars that began to flicker through the canopy of trees, when the silence was broken by a strange sound. A whistle. Simple but sharp, like someone trying to catch my attention. I turned instinctively, expecting to see an animal or maybe another camper, but there was no one there. I stood still listening. The whistle came again, louder this time, and it was followed by something even more unsettling, a silhouette. At first, I thought it was just one of the large tree trunks or an oddly shaped bush, but as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, the figure seemed to move slowly, as if watching me. A chill ran down my spine. I shouted for my dad, and he came running. The silhouette vanished instantly, as though it had never been there. "Probably just a bird," he said, trying to calm me down. "Sometimes they make sounds that can resemble whistles. As for the shadow, your imagination's probably just playing tricks." At the time, I wanted to believe him. I was only 10, after all, and my dad had always been a calm and reliable presence. But as we ate dinner by the fire, the feeling that something else was out there, hiding in the dark, refused to leave me. In the months that followed, the whistles returned. Not every time we camped, but when they did, I knew I wasn't imagining things. They were always the same, starting as a distant, eerie sound, followed by that familiar feeling of being watched. Every time I tried to show my dad, the noises would stop, and the shadows I glimpsed among the trees would vanish. He continued to brush it off as birds or other campers, but each time I heard that whistle, my heart would race in a way nothing else could. There was one night in particular, years later, that still sticks with me. We had set up camp in a more remote location than usual, far from the popular trails. The night was colder than normal, and the silence of the forest was almost total. By then, I had grown used to the quiet of the woods at night, but this stillness felt wrong. That's when the whistles started again. This time, they were much closer, almost as if they were circling our campsite. The fear I felt was immediate, and the unease I had pushed aside for years came rushing back in full force. This time, there was no doubt that my dad heard it too. He stopped what he was doing and stared out into the darkness surrounding us. I asked almost breathlessly, "Did you hear that?" He hesitated, something he rarely did, and replied, "It's just the wind. Or some animal. Nothing to worry about." But his tone was different. For the first time, I realized he didn't know what we were hearing either. Over the years, I returned to that park, both with my father and later, as an adult on my own camping trips. The dream of becoming a ranger always stayed with me, but that lingering sense that something existed in the shadows of the forest, watching, never left either. I eventually graduated and got my first job as a ranger, working in the parks that had fascinated me for so long. But every time I ventured into an isolated area, the memory of that whistle came back, reminding me that even in the heart of nature, there are things we can't explain. My father, until his final days, held firm to the belief that it had just been birds or other campers. But for me, those whistles always felt like something more, something that defied explanation and made me realize that, as much as I loved the wilderness, there were mysteries it held that were better left undisturbed. I always knew solitude was part of the job. As a park ranger stationed in a fire lookout tower, isolated deep in the forest, I was prepared for long, quiet nights, endless days without human contact, and the vast expanse of trees surrounding me. What I wasn't prepared for was the sensation of being watched, especially by something I couldn't understand. It was a clear night, and the moon illuminated the forest around my tower, casting long shadows between the trees. Everything was calm, just the soft sound of wind rustling the leaves. From up high, I had a perfect view of the horizon, with miles of dense forest stretching out in every direction. I had been on the job for 3 months, and so far, nothing unusual had happened. But that night, everything changed. It was around 1 a.m. when I saw it for the first time, a human-like figure, far off in the distance, walking at the edge of the forest. At first, I thought it was a lost hiker. It wasn't uncommon for tourists to wander off trails, even at night. So my first instinct was to grab the spotlight and shine it toward the figure. I aimed the light at where I had seen them, but as soon as the beam hit the area, the figure had moved. It was gone. Confused, I swept the light around, trying to locate the person again. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them again, closer this time, walking in slow circles around the base of the tower. My heart began to race, but I tried to stay calm. Maybe it was just a camper playing a prank, or someone confused about where they were. I picked up the radio and tried to call the park rangers, but there was no response. The radio was dead, only faint static buzzing in the background. I continued trying to shine the spotlight on the figure, but every time I moved the light, they seemed to stay just out of reach, always one step ahead. Their movements were slow, deliberate, yet somehow they managed to move faster than should have been possible. There was no noise, no sound of branches snapping or leaves crunching, just that dark silhouette moving around the tower. For hours, I watched, trying to make sense of what was happening. The figure never stopped, circling the tower's base, but never getting close enough for me to see them clearly. The spotlight could never fully capture them, only a fleeting glimpse here and there at the edges of my vision. The night dragged on painfully, with a constant sense that something was terribly wrong. Finally, as dawn began to break on the horizon, the figure vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. I wondered if it had all been a hallucination brought on by isolation. But I knew what I had seen, and even as the morning light filled the forest, the feeling of unease stayed with me. Once the sun was high enough, I climbed down from the tower to investigate. What I found made my blood run cold. There were footprints on the ground, forming a perfect circle around the tower. Human footprints, large and deep, as if someone had been walking there for hours. I followed them for a few meters, trying to figure out where they came from. But then, without explanation, they stopped. No trail leading back into the forest, no sign of where the person, or whatever it was, had gone. The footprints simply disappeared in the middle of the path, as if the figure had materialized out of thin air and then vanished the same way. I reported the incident to my supervisor, but as expected, he brushed it off. He suggested I had simply seen a lost hiker who wandered off before daylight. I tried to accept that explanation, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. The disappearing footprints, the way the figure moved, always staying just beyond the light, it was all too strange. For the next few nights, I saw no more figures, but the feeling of being watched never left. Every night, as I stared out into the forest, I couldn't shake the sensation that something was still out there, circling, waiting. I never figured out who or what that figure was. Maybe I never will. But ever since that night, the forest, once my place of peace, now feels like it's hiding something darker, something that prefers to stay hidden until the sun goes down. In 1984, I landed a job that most people would find boring, but to me, it was perfect. I spent 6 weeks in a lookout tower at Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming, working for the U.S. Forest Service. The idea of being isolated, surrounded by nature, was exactly what I was looking for. The tower I was assigned to was in the far northern section of the park, a simple yet imposing structure that allowed me to see miles and miles of dense, untamed forest. It was a lonely job, but I thought I knew what to expect. Or so I thought. Communication was done via radio, a direct line with other lookouts, and the main base. For the first few days, I only heard the basics, weather reports, trail updates, and the occasional safety warnings. It was during this routine that I first met James. One afternoon, his deep, friendly voice called out over the radio, asking how I was adjusting. He said he was stationed in a tower not too far from mine, also monitoring for fires. He seemed experienced, the kind of guy you'd trust right away. He shared stories about life in the towers, from bear encounters to terrifying storms. His stories were good company during the long hours of isolation. Over time, we started talking every day. James had a laid-back way of telling his tales, but one of them particularly unsettled me. He mentioned that the previous lookout assigned to my tower had mysteriously disappeared. Just vanished, he said with a dark tone. One day he was there, the next day gone. They didn't tell you much when they sent you here, did they? That bothered me, though I tried to shrug it off. There was something in the way he said it that stuck with me. In the following weeks, the conversations with James grew stranger. He started mentioning odd sounds around his tower, heavy footsteps in the middle of the night, shadows moving between the trees. At first, I thought he was exaggerating, maybe trying to scare me for fun. But as time passed, he sounded more and more disturbed. "They're watching me," he said one night. "They're out there, waiting." His voice had a tremor that sent a chill down my spine. I asked if he wanted me to report it, but he always refused, saying he was handling it. Then came the night when everything fell apart. I was on my shift, and the radio had been quiet for a few hours when I heard James's voice, barely audible, calling my name. "Harold, something's wrong. It's too close now." The panic in his voice was real. I tried talking to him, but all I heard were muffled noises and heavy breathing. Suddenly, his voice came back, screaming, begging for help. "Harold, please. They're here. They're taking me." I felt completely helpless, clutching the radio, not knowing what to do. Then the line went dead, and I tried calling him several times. Nothing. Absolute silence. My first instinct was to call the base. I explained what had happened and asked them to send someone to check on James. I was sure he was in trouble, but what I got in response was an awkward silence on the other end. After a long pause, the voice of the operator returned. "Harold, there's no James in our system. There's no tower in that area. Who have you been talking to?" The ground fell out from under me. For weeks, I've been talking to someone who didn't exist. I repeated the story, the details, every conversation we had, but the authorities insisted there was no James working for the Forest Service and no tower where he said he was. They told me it was likely some stranger had managed to tune into the radio frequency and had been playing a joke on me the whole time. A prank, they said. A prank? I had spent weeks talking to this man, hearing his growing fear, believing he was in danger. And in the end, it was all some cruel joke? The humiliation hit me like a punch to the gut. I was isolated in that tower, relying on the radio as my only connection to the outside world. And someone had exploited that, turning my work into a twisted game. The solitude that had once been comforting now became unbearable. I spent the final weeks of my shift tormented by shame, distrusting every sound on the radio, unable to relax. I felt like a fool, tricked by a voice that was nothing more than a shadow on the air. When my time at the tower finally ended, I left that place with a heavy heart. I never found out who James was or why he did what he did. Maybe it was just some bored person laughing at my gullibility. But the experience left a deep mark on me. It wasn't just the isolation that broke me. It was the betrayal of believing in someone who never existed. And to this day, the sound of James's final scream echoes in my mind. Even knowing it was fake, a part of me still wonders, what if it wasn't? If you enjoyed these true horror stories, you won't want to miss our next video. Check out True Bathroom Horror Story by clicking the card on the screen or finding it as the previous video on our channel. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know in the comments if you've ever had a paranormal experience. We'd love to hear your stories. Stay brave, and we'll see you in the next video.